Hi everybody, welcome to Platform Leaders. We've got a fantastic program for you. We're going to talk about misinformation and fake news on social media, regulating for growth, and how AI is both disrupting and accelerating businesses and service marketplaces in particular. I'm Laure Reillier, Platform Leaders co-chair and CEO of Launchworks & Co. For those of you joining for the first time, Platform Leaders brings together the communities building the future of digital platforms, and that includes entrepreneurs, investors, practitioners, policymakers, and academics. So today you can interact and submit your questions, comments, reactions through the chat. You can choose to share your questions with everyone or just the panelists, and we do our best to surface them at the relevant time. The event today is illustrated in real time by David Vignoli, and we'll share what he captures throughout the event. So now let's move on to what's in store for today. So we've got 3 sessions. First, we'll start with our keynote from Professor Marshall van Alstyne on misinformation and fake news. And second, we'll move to the panel on regulating for growth with Professor Annabelle Gawer, Rory O'Donoghue, Alexander Baker, and Daniel Gordon. And then I'll chair the panel on the impact of AI on service platforms with Sébastien de Lafond, Tito Unda, and Jeremy Gottschalk. And finally, Benoît Reillier, my co-chair, will wrap up the event with some concluding remarks. Now, the common themes in all our sessions today is obviously platforms, but also AI. We believe we need to prepare individuals, organizations, and institutions for transformative AI. And that's why we soft launched the Collective Intelligence.ai initiative. We currently have a working group working on the future of search. How do you get discovered in this new world, in this new AI world? So I've got a quick poll for you today. I'm curious to find out how prepared you believe we are for transformative AI. First, you as an individual, but also your organization or the organization that you're the closest to. And finally, at the society or institution level. So we've got 3 questions for you. How would you say you're prepared for transformative AI on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 not prepared at all and 10 perfectly prepared? And you can answer the other 2 questions for your organization and for institutions. Wow, very interesting. So as an individual, I think people are prepared, we can say. But then at the organizational level, we see actually some slightly different levels. And then at the society level, clearly less prepared. So, and there's clearly room for improvement. So very interesting. Thank you very much for that. So do get in touch if this is of interest. You'll see more communication about Collective Intelligence.ai later this year, and my colleague will tell you more in his closing remarks. So let's now move to our keynote. We're incredibly excited to have Professor Marshall van Alstyne with us today. Professor van Alstyne is the Allen and Kelli Questrom Chaired Professor in Information Systems at Boston University. He's also a Digital Fellow at MIT IDE. Marshall is one of the world's foremost experts on network business models and co-author of the international bestseller Platform Revolution. I met Marshall on many occasions. Launchworks has been invited to the Platform Strategy Research Symposium and the MIT Platform Strategy Summit in Boston. And by the way, don't miss the next one on the 17th of July. So today, Marshall is going to talk to us about his latest research on how to deal with misinformation and fake news on social media. So Marshall, it's a pleasure to welcome you on Platform Leaders. Over to you.
Laure, kind of you to have me on board. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let me speak directly to the audience. There's so many issues involved, and I really would like to make this a conversation. because I personally think that the misinformation problem is one of the biggest challenges we face today. We can't solve issues of global warming or who's president or whether vaccines work or not if we cannot agree on basic facts. And I think our political situation is one that's actually quite concerning. For those of you who may or may not know, our own research on misinformation was canceled by the current administration. So it's an interesting time that we are in. I do want to offer, however, a message of hope, because I actually think what I'd like to present today is what I think are some possible solutions. I'm going to argue that our current approaches don't necessarily work very well. I'll see if I can explain why I think that's the case and what we might do differently. But I actually want to give you two different things. One of them is a theory of what might actually help solve the problem. And then the second is a bit of evidence. We've actually done a bit of research and want to see if we can provide some of those. So I want to separate these two separate things. So let me launch in and see what you can think of what's happening. I do think misinformation is implicated in a large number of different problems concerning us today. So, for example, misinformation has been implicated in, the insurrection. Let's see, we need to continue to share, make sure that everything's visible. Laura, is everything visible okay? I want to make sure that
Yes, it's working perfectly fine, Marshall.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Okay. So social media and misinformation were implicated in the insurrection in the United States. They were implicated in the insurrection in Brazil. Misinformation was also implicated in the riots in the UK, where there were false claims of someone stabbing children when in fact it was a British citizen. In fact, misinformation and social media have been implicated in a huge number of different problems, including insurrection, riots, lynching, money laundering, suicide, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, child exploitation, judicial intimidation, terrorist recruiting. The historian and philosopher Yuval Noah Harari asked this wonderful question. If social media are connecting us in ways that bring us together, why is everyone so angry? And it doesn't matter where you look, whether it's in Israel or the UK or France or Germany or Brazil, the United States. There's a lot of polarization that's taking place. So what is it that's happening? What is it that we could do about it? I'd like to thank a UK team for trying to summarize all of the interventions on misinformation. So there was a report that came out last year. And this is a summary of all the ones that are tried out across the globe. And the bubbles here represent, the color represents the type of intervention, whether it's accuracy prompt or friction or media literacy tips or social norms. And then also the locations around the globe where these studies have actually been tried out. And a large number of different things have been tried across the globe. If we summarize them, however, I would argue that each of them suffers from a large number of different problems. So the blue lists the interventions and their complications. And if I've omitted any, please reach out to me. I actually would love to hear from you. But I think every single one of these interventions suffers from at least one, if not four, of the following problems. So the first is the arms race, and this is particularly problematic, as Laura just mentioned, for artificial intelligence. Deep fakes are going to make this even more problematic, as you could make politicians or individuals appear to do or appear to say things that they never even considered or did at all. And so you're trying to use technology to create and detect, and yet there's always going to be another mechanism to avoid detection. So the arms race is a deep problem. Another one, if somebody's doing the fact checking, then the people that are lying are entirely happy to lie about the parties that are fact checking them. So they actually then try to simply discredit them. And this is one of the reasons we're having such problems with our institutions today. So science is being discredited, academics are being discredited, government institutions, churches, any organization that then stands in the way of those who would disseminate misinformation are being discredited. Another one is, I think, subtler. And this is one I think that is not appreciated in most of the interventions, is I think they put the responsibility on the wrong foot. Solutions such as community notes put it on the let users decide as opposed to the source. But I ask you the question, does it make social sense for one individual, the author, to check their facts once before distributing it to thousands of people or millions of people? Or does it make sense for thousands of people or millions of people to have to check it? Well, the social costs of the latter are overwhelmingly in the wrong direction. So I think that we need to see if we can put responsibility on the authors of content rather than the recipients of content. In a pollution context, that would be the equivalent of asking citizens to wear gas masks and filter their own water, as opposed to ask the factories to stop polluting. The last one is one that not a single one of these solutions, and no other solutions that I'm aware of, makes it cheaper to do honest journalism than it is to make stuff up. It's really easy, and especially now with generative AI, to make stuff up. So fake news and misinformation are extremely easy to create and share, and honest truth is very hard to dig up. So the cost structure favors falsity over fact. But I want to diagnose the problem differently. So I want to think, most people think the problem in some sense is truth or fakeness of it. And I'm going to argue that's not the nub of the problem. I'll give you an example. Much false information just doesn't matter. What about an ad exaggeration or irony or parody or fake news that's disbelieved? It's not a problem. I love this particular, compliment. The planet's fine. The people are effed. This was George Carlin talking about global warming. Well, of course, the planet's not fine, but he's using parody to highlight some of the problems. Or think about truth. In many cases, true news that's disbelieved is a potential problem. You make the bad policy decisions. Or sometimes anti-vax groups will use two truths to create a lie. They might argue that the famous politician General Colin Powell received the COVID vaccine and still died of COVID anyway, implying that it was ineffective, but they omit the fact that he had blood cancer and so would have died anyway. So that's another interesting element of it. Or I credit the Allen team and others for highlighting this true claim. It was actually in the Chicago Tribune that a healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine, CDC investigating. This went massively viral on Instagram and Facebook with over 50 million views. And it was a true statement, and it was never flagged because it was a true statement. And yet, after the fact, it was discovered, of course, that he died of stomach problems completely unrelated to the COVID vaccine. So it did cause interesting problems. I'm going to argue that it's decision errors and externalities. Well, what are externalities? Externalities are damage that occurs off platform. So this might be a pizza parlor shooting or clickbait on water where they claim that there are clear worms in Dasani water. And Coca-Cola and the Federal Trade Commission had to put out their own separate statements to say this wasn't true, but it was being created as clickbait. Or Salman Rushdie is stabbed by someone who was radicalized from third-party readings of the videos or watching videos and had never even read his works. Or if you consider the loss of herd immunity from the anti-vax propositions. In the United States, we now have measles outbreaks coming out of Texas that are the worst of in 50 years because folks weren't vaccinated. We're not taking action on global warming, or we're seeing insurrections. These are damages that occur off platform that the platforms themselves are not internalizing. And here's why this is interesting. All too often, our solutions are to turn the problem over to what was often called the marketplace of ideas. And this just doesn't actually work. In fact, you often want government intervention to do this, but we don't, you often lead to or promote government intervention to solve these kinds of problems, but this has other complications. The implications of this are twofold, and I want to use this as description, explanation, and eventually resolution. Here, the idea is there's too much pollution taking place. And this also explains why social media have made this different than it was 20, 30 years ago, or even 15 years ago. Now, everybody's a polluter of information. There's lots of production of the pollution, but no one is internalizing the cost. It's really hard to hold individuals accountable. And under our current laws, the platforms are not accountable. In the United States, it's the Section 230. In Europe, it's the Digital Services Act. So the platforms are not themselves necessarily accountable for user-generated content, making it problematic. The second is there's too little correction. Attempts by courts or society to use the marketplace of ideas to sort things out, to let users decide, will fail. The reason? Markets do not self-correct market failures. Externalities are market failures. So we need some kind of intervention to actually solve the problem. So again, I want to use that as both explanation for what's happening, why it's become so problematic, but that then also gives us some levers for possibly dealing with it. To give you some theories. In economics, we have two ways that we know of, only two. Imagine that there are factories that are dumping pollutants into the air and the water. The first of these are given to us by Arthur P. Gu, and he has really interesting ideas. Well, you can either tax the sales, such as in social media, that would be advertising, put a quota on effluent. These are government solutions. They're centralized solutions. The problem with that is that a government quota on speech is what? That is censorship. That's the very definition of censorship. So it's extremely hard to use those kinds of solutions. Looking back more carefully, this is one of the things we've been working on for the research. This is the theory part. There's an entirely different set of ideas developed by Ron Coase, who won the Nobel Prize, partly for transactions cost theories, but also for his theories on externalities. An externality, a market, where there are negative externalities, where there's pollution, does not internalize the harms. Rather than having the government do it, there may be ways of using decentralized solutions to actually solve this problem. In his original context was radio spectrum. So one tower might broadcast, it increases signal, interfering with another, and that would both increase their signals, creating radio noise. His insight was, it's not the government that says, okay, radio tower A should produce and B should not. Rather, you create property rights in the spectrum so that the best use case can buy it. So if A has the best use case, they can buy it. If B has the best use case, they can buy it. And if C comes up as a startup, they could buy it later. And you get much more efficient solutions from this decentralized. Now, how would we implement that in the context of misinformation and speech? Well, this raises the question, what is the scarce resource? That's the resource that's being abused. In this picture, it's land, it's air, and water. In our case, it's attention. What is it that information is consuming? What is it that's being abused? Herbert Simon, another Nobel Prize winner, argues information consumes something that's obvious. It's the attention of its recipients. It's your attention that's being abused by social media and other institutions, other technology companies. So how would we then create property rights in attention? Here's my suggestions as to ways you might actually do this. What I want to do is I want to give you an expanded set of rights, not a diminished set of rights, but an expanded set of rights. So here they are. So this is, again, the theory portion of it. So first I want to give you a fundamental right in your own attention. The first of these is a listener's right. You can listen to any source you want, right? This means you have the right to focus your attention on your preferred sources. So if there are a lot of polluted information streams, you could focus on the clean information streams. You could choose the BBC. You could choose the Financial Times. You could choose, the German newspapers. But there's a complication. You can also choose, you can choose Breitbart. You could choose whatever one you want. The complication, however, is then filter bubbles. You could choose to hear only what you believe, so you could actually become isolated. That's the downside. That's the extreme use or exercise of that right. Balancing that, I want to give you another additional right. I want to give you a speaker's right to be heard. This is an individual expressive right to influence decisions that affect you, to counter disagreeable speech with agreeable speech, but influencing decisions entails the right to being heard. What's fascinating is no country in the world I'm aware of grants a right to be heard. Even the most expensive set of rights in the United States is a right to speak. It is not a right to be heard. Matter of fact, there's even an expression, you have a right to speak, you don't have a right to reach. Interestingly enough, the free exercise of that right in its extreme also has its own downside, which is you could lie to people or you could jam their signals, you could speak over them, you can use their attention to your private advantage. What I'd like to do is propose a way. So how do you balance the right not to hear against the right to be heard? What I want to do is I want to give you an argument for a way to cancel both the negative effects and capture the positive effects. I want to cancel the filter bubble and cancel the lying. I want to give you the right to override the right not to be heard, but conditional on accepting liability for misuse of your right. We're going to use a Coasean insight. So if you didn't want to hear me, I could actually then vouchsafe that what I'm claiming is true. Notice I'm the source, I'm the author of the content. And then it would be presented almost as if it were an ad. Give you a simple illustration. Here's a possible implementation. So I want to move from the theory to the implementation. Imagine, for example, that just like an advertisement, you might place 3 times the normal ad price in escrow, and then it would be presented to the audience. If no one proves that it's false, I get it back so that it's free. If anyone proves that it's false, they claim that value and it becomes theirs. They're motivated to prove that I'm actually not telling the truth. Now I'm the source and I have to make a choice. If I know I'm lying, well, I'd want to use a traditional ad. If I know I'm telling the truth, I'd want to use this vouchsafe mechanism because it's free to me. But it's now a credible signal to the other side in a way that actually makes it to work. Notice this gives you the right to pierce a filter bubble. If someone else is not listening and you want to be able to present facts, this gives you that right and it's free. Notice, however, that if you're going to try to lie, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be way more expensive than simply taking out an ad. So that's the theory. We tested it. So I'd like to give credit to my co-authors on some research. We actually did a little bit of experimental testing on this. And the way so Nichols, Parker, Mazar, Pennycook, and Rand were all joining us. What we did is we tested this among it's in two different sets. So one is in about 1,500 social media users, and another's about 2,000 social media users. It's over 30,000, and collectively it's over 60,000 responses. And it's distributed across the population among men, women, trans, Democrat and Republican, and others. And so here's what we checked. We presented headlines and asked folks, would they be willing to share? And with just like social media, we're going to reward you starting for interesting stuff. You'll get 5 cents. And if you're sharing boring stuff, they'll take away 5 cents. Or you could choose to do absolutely nothing if you don't think that it's interesting or boring, and you can do nothing. It's like social media where you're being rewarded with followers and likes for sharing interesting content. The next condition was one of the standard tests. It's an accuracy nudge. We'll simply make you think, or remind you that if you share true information, you could do it, or share false. It could have implications, but there's no consequence. You're going to get the exact same reward if you're sharing false information, and you're going to get the exact same reward if you're sharing interesting information. It's just making you think about it. The third one is the mechanism we're talking about, where in this case, it's binding. This means that if you pierce a filter bubble with false information, it's going to cost you 10 cents. If you pierce a filter bubble with correct information, you're going to be rewarded with 10 cents. You have the choice of any of these. You can still try to share the information without warranting, and it won't cost you anything. You could choose not to share. You have all of the options of the above. So there's no requirement at all. It's simply a voluntary option. So here's what we found in the first study, okay? Well, sure enough, and the yellow is false and the blue is true in these stories. And sure enough, in the normal condition, well, folks are sharing the interesting content, and so they're sharing more falsity than truth. So we had a completely balanced panel. It was across half boring, interesting stories, half true, false stories. But in this condition, they're sharing more false stories than true. Why? Because you're being rewarded for interesting content. When we reminded you that it was true or false, there's no reduction in the sharing of the interesting stuff, but folks tended to share more true information. So there was a statistically significant increase in the sharing of truth. But in the costly condition, notice, by the way, so there's no effect on the sharing of falsity. But in the costly condition, under the vouchsafe condition, if it's binding, we get this big improvement in the sharing of truth, not only relative to the control, but even relative to the reminder. So folks share even better, and we get this benefit that falsity also decreases. In other words, the total discernment is much better. You get a reduction in falsity and an increase in truth compared to either the baseline or just the reminder. So that's on the sharing side. We reran the same set of experiments, now asking the recipients, what did they think? So after you'd received a story, what would it look like? So we labeled it's the exact same set of headlines, and now there's a case of A, no label at all. Case B, you would learn that other people had shared the story. Does this make it more or less credible? And then there are cases C and D where, one, they're reminded to share true, but there's no consequence if they don't. And then the last one is case D, where it's binding. If they share truth, it's binding. If they share falsity, it's going to cost them 10 cents. And you then had to rate the story on whether or not you thought it was not at all accurate, which is 1. Intermediate was 4. And if you thought it was completely accurate, then it was rated on 7. Here's what we found. Okay, in information economics, this was signaling and screening, right? You're getting, signal is it a more credible signal or not? And screening is, on the recipient side, do they believe it or not? Well, the first part is good news. People were actually able to discern true and false stories. So remember, on a scale, 1 was false and 7 was completely true. So it's actually true. So if you looked at the true stories, folks tended to rate them a little above 5. You looked at the false stories, folks tended to rate them around 2. So great, they actually perceived correctly. If they learned that it had been shared, no effect. It wasn't more credible or less credible. If they learned that it was a reminder to share true information, then it was actually more credible. So folks actually found it more believable. And then finally, if it was vouchsafed, if folks were willing to not only stake their reputation, but also they had to pay for it if they were lying to you, this was even more statistically significant. So that was even more credible. Exact same story, but a stronger signal in here. One interesting thing that we didn't expect that was kind of fascinating was that if you were to vouchsafe a false story, then that was more credible too. So that strong signal actually made false stories appear more accurate. And so that was quite interesting. The one other thing that we had not expected that was really kind of interesting and very promising for the business models was that if you take the social media baseline case, out of 24 stories, they might share 7.8. Under the warrant condition, they shared 9.4. That means engagement went up, not down, but up. If you look across a lot of the different interventions, they add friction to it, and which is, unattractive to the business models because it reduces the engagement. But this is a voluntary option to pierce filter bubbles. With this voluntary option to do additional, gain additional reach for your communications, folks, you liked this, and they actually shared more stories overall. So let me quickly summarize. Here's a list of a bunch of different benefits, but if you look at the ones marked in green, 1, 3, 4, 9, and the others, those address every single one of the problems I mentioned with the other interventions. This changes the cost structure so that it's actually cheaper to tell the truth. You can pierce a filter bubble with vouchsafed facts in it. It avoids the arms race problem because we're using mechanism design. You're using juries to actually do the adjudication. So it's extremely hard to actually discredit a peer jury in this context. So it avoids the arms race, and we address the AI pending problem. It also changes the misplaced responsibility. Who's the first party to certify? It's the author. So you're more likely to actually tell the truth because it's your decision in here. It's putting the burden back on the source, not on the destination. And then just drawing attention to the last two, notice at no point in any of this is any content censored at all. We've simply given you the right to signal that you're telling the truth and to reach an audience you wouldn't otherwise reach. There's no friction on any audience that wanted to hear you because that's their listener's right. Notice also there is by design absolutely no central authority at all. Not government, not platform, not Elon Musk, not Mark Zuckerberg. Nobody is able to influence or bias the outcome. Not even I as the designer could bias the outcome. So for those of you that are interested, we have 2 working papers on that. So the theory is in the first one. It's free speech and the fake news problem. And the evidence is under review. That's Truth is Warranted, the impact of self-certification on misinformation. The other 2 papers, so what I presented is 1 and 4. The other 2 papers are policy papers on how we might actually implement some of these ideas, either on platforms themselves or in the law. And with that, by all means, please give me your toughest questions. Please disagree with anything you would like. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we can do better, because I'd really like to help solve this problem. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Marshall. That was really fascinating presentation. We've got some great questions that came through the chat. There's one from Anna, and I think there's another one which is along the same line. So I'm going to ask this one. So your proposed system aligns really well with the US regulatory context, where litigation is shaping outcomes. So how applicable would it be in an EU context where the rule-based ex-ante regulation obligations, like those under the DSA, or even in a UK context where it's principles-based? What would be the adaptations that would be required?
So I love that question. So I'd like to make an a fortiori argument, the point being that if it can work under the most restrictive conditions, being the most restrictive where government can't intervene, this is in the United States, then it ought to work even more easily in less restrictive conditions. So in the UK or in Europe, it's easier for government to intervene. So my argument is that it's been designed to work under the most restrictive conditions. So I'm hoping that it would be able to work anywhere, perhaps even in totalitarian countries, were they willing to allow it, because there's no central authority in here. The market should become self-cleaning because folks are internalizing their externalities. So I'm optimistic that by the theory, again, this would remain to be tested out, by the theory, it should require no adaptation at all in order to be adapted from a US context to UK context or Brazilian or European context. That's the hope.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marshall, for your presentation. And there's lots of questions in the chat. If you want to answer them directly, please feel free to do so. But unfortunately, we have to move on to our next panel, Regulating for Growth. So let
me just say thank you for hosting me. And folks that are interested, by all means, use the email below. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. And Laure, thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marshall. So let me introduce our next panel and Professor Annabelle Gawer, the chair of the panel. So Professor Gawer is chaired professor in digital economy and the director of the Center of Digital Economy at the University of Surrey. She is a world-class academic pioneer in digital platforms and platform-based innovation ecosystems. She was appointed as an independent digital expert for the UK Competition and Markets Authority in 2023. She has advised the European Commission on the regulation of online platforms. She has also advised the UK House of Lords, the UK government, and the OECD. Annabelle co-authored 2 excellent books on platforms, The Business of Platforms and Platform Leadership. Annabelle, over to you. I'll let you introduce Rory, Alexander, and Daniel.
Delighted to be sharing this panel where we have fantastic guests today. Thank you very much, platform leaders and Benoit, as well as Laure Reillier for organizing this session. We are going to have a fantastic conversation about the question of regulating, but for what? Regulating for growth. So let me introduce my my esteemed panelists. So we're gonna have Daniel Gordon, who is a partner at the Greenlight, and who has amazing experience both at the CMA for a number of years, as well as the Treasury. We have Alexander Baker, who is the CEO of Fingleton, who is the strategic regulatory advisory, and who was also working previously at the OFT and has a lot of experience in these regulatory questions. And we have also Rory O'Donoghue, who is leading global innovation policy and government in the government affair part of Google. So I wanted to just have a very brief introduction to situate our panel. We know that there have been developments in the past few years and very recently at an increasing space of regulatory activity in the domain of digital platforms. Obviously, with the European Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act that have attempted to solve the problem that was perceived that despite antitrust actions that lasted a long time against Google and others, there had been a feeling among regulatory circles and some part of civil society that the existing regulatory cadre and framework were not addressing some of the abuse of power problem, and in particular competition policy. So the DMA in particular is an attempt to complement existing rules which were mostly done ex post with an ex ante framework, creating a new status of gatekeepers, which is a small subset of the largest digital platforms, and imposing on them a list of do's and don'ts of activities that they should do or that should refrain to do. We've also seen in the UK, so closer to us, with the DMCC Act an approach that is trying to that is giving new powers to the CMA, and that is going to develop code of conduct for, again, a small subset of digital platform firms. They are not called in the UK gatekeepers. They're called firms with strategic market status. Again, with the idea that it would be important to regulate digital platforms. We also see on the other side of the Atlantic a number of activities from the Department of Justice with actions against some of the largest digital platforms. So in this setting where we see regulatory activity or judicial activity directed at trying to curtail the power of big tech platforms, we also see this message, especially given by the UK, that this regulation is not meant to curtail the success of companies, but it's really rather meant to enable conditions for growth. So we see these words of we regulate for innovation, we regulate for growth, and this panel is really going to try to tease out what could this mean, in particular in the UK context, but also in these other contexts. So this question of regulating for growth, what does it mean? What are the trade-offs? What does it mean concretely? And I would like to start by asking Daniel Gordon here. Daniel, if you could tell us, based in particular in your experience at the CMA, and also given your knowledge of the Treasury, what does growth mean in this context? Is it growth in terms of more users are going to grow? Is it more growth on the demand side? Is it growth on the supply side? Is it growth for existing incumbent firms? Is it growth with new entrants and SMEs? And what is the role of innovation in its context? So what are the main growth levers? And if you can see, are there some trade-offs there in this agenda for growth? Very, very eager to hear your views on this, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annabelle, and thanks really for the kind introduction. I was at the Treasury many years ago, right? And I did run it was a small analytic team looking at the economic foundations of growth. And this was back, it's so long ago, back under the Blair Brown days, where they're very keen on driving evidence-based policy. What I thought would be useful and be really interesting to contrast the view and the relationship between competition and regulatory policy as was conceived then, and then look at how it looks now, because there's been a radical change in perception. If you roll back the clock to that time, we were very focused on trend growth. You asked what we mean by growth. The best thing to think about is productivity, is a measure output worker, output per head, output hour, those sorts of things to be looking at. And there was an increasing evidence that competition was a good driver of growth, based on international experience, based on firm level evidence, based on growth accounting approaches, those sorts of things. And that this was something also that contrasted, that explained what was a gap in productivity performance between the UK and comparative countries at the time. Now that was, and it was a competition, it was never seen as sort of a key driver of growth, but it was one of the drivers of growth, and there were 5 in total. But that was an innovation to bring competition into growth, and it changed this concept, the context and the positioning of competition policy. It moved it from a sort of technocratic, reactive agency approach to wanting to be proactive, to seeing it as a part of economic policy, as a part of structural policy. And the legislation that it gave rise to, the white paper actually drew out on that evidence base leading to that, and it gave rise to the 2002 Enterprise Act, which drew on that and said we need a proactive agency, we need a robust agency, and enhanced its powers in a number of ways. Merger powers, criminalization of cartels, stronger markets powers, the area I looked after for many years, were all enhanced because it was seen as necessary to drive growth. Now that's back in 2002, right? Now, if you roll the clock forward, that perception from government and also officials has changed, it seems, right? And it started under the previous government. There was the Microsoft Activision merger was a particular flashpoint. And Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, said that the CMA must understand its wider responsibilities to promote growth. There's a very clear sort of indication that he was a bit worried that it was out of kilter with that. But it wasn't just the last government, right? It's the current government. As we've seen, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, made similar sorts of comments about it's important to make sure that every regulator in the country, especially our economic and competition regulators, he said, take growth seriously. And of course, those who are familiar with the UK landscape will be aware that the chair of the CMA, Marcus Bockerink, was dismissed in January. Again, because there was a lack of satisfaction about the CMA's focus on growth. And so the question is, what explains that difference? And when I'm talking about the UK context, I'm hoping a lot that I say chimes with context in other countries as well, particularly actually in the EU. Because you could say, look, that is just a response of the government to big business. That's they've just been lobbied. It's just and big business would do that, and they don't like what the CMA is doing, and nor you would say, well, they shouldn't always like what the CMA is doing, so they're using channels in government. I think, you can't dismiss that entirely, but I think that to accept that explanation is only to accept part of the story. And I think it's particularly important to recognize that the sorts of areas where these tensions tend to arise is in dynamic innovation, digital markets. And I don't think that's surprising. And I think the simple truth is that competition policy has built up a lot of tools and is very good at looking at traditional markets. It tends to look at the measures it looks at: concentration, market power itself, profitability, excess prices. All those sorts of things are very good in assessing competition in markets where innovation takes place, but not in the same way as these big, dynamic, innovative markets where there's often a winner-takes-all dynamic. And the competition takes place through innovation rather than through those traditional variables. But we haven't got those tools. They really just haven't been developed in the same way to understand the drivers of innovation in the same way that they have for the traditional markets, for bricks and mortar, static competition markets. Because even the term monopoly, I think, is sometimes challenging one to pull across, because when we get concerned about monopolies, we get concerned, yes, about excessive prices and those sorts of things. But when it comes to growth, what we're most worried about is a lazy fat cat not innovating, being inefficient because it doesn't have the competitive disciplines. And that can chime with a lot of sort of more traditional markets. But if you look at the big platforms, for example, it's any fair assessment would say, look, they do innovate quite a lot, right? They spend a very high proportion of their revenues compared to other companies on R&D, and that not just on input measures, on output measures as well. So we need a sort of more nuanced approach. And I'm not saying that we need to just let rip and not have any regulatory framework. I was involved at the CMA in the background work to the setting up the DNU, and there are still good arguments for, and there are good arguments for having an ex-ante regime. But we need the right tools, and we need the tools to develop so that as they capture the nuance of that, it doesn't just fall back on big is bad when it comes to innovation, and doesn't just say entry is good. You need also to make sure that you're safeguarding existing incentives. So that as I say, that there will be room for encouraging entry, but doing it in the right ways. But I think before we do that, we all in the competition community internationally need to look quite long and hard at whether we've got the right tools to do that. And this is particularly important to growth at the moment, because just to go back to that, the initial theme, because one of the startling facts that people look at in recent growth performance is they compare US performance with that in the UK and that in the EU. Whereas since the financial crisis, 2008, there's been quite impressive growth in the US. But in the EU, we haven't seen that. And in the UK, we haven't seen that. We've seen a fairly sclerotic performance. And this, of course, was the centerpiece of Draghi report. And Draghi, along with many others, pointed to the lack of scale and the need to encourage innovation in order to do that. And when you look into the drivers of growth in those areas, you do get to some. You do see that the big companies, as well as small companies, have driven innovation and and that innovation has had spillover effects that have had positive impacts on growth. So if my headline message at the end is if we're going to focus more on growth in these tech markets, it's really important that we take a nuanced and intelligent approach to that and understands the incentives both on small players, the incentives and abilities both on small players and on large players to do that and to deliver those wider spillover effects that are good for the economy and long-term trend growth.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you for explaining so well that the tools that we had up until now may not be appropriate to really understand the nuanced and dynamic behavior of these digital markets. And thank you for clarifying these points. I would like to turn to Alexander now. Alex, can you help us decrypt what the government means when they want to steer regulators towards a pro-growth agenda? What scenarios do you think they have in mind in the UK? And perhaps you can compare and contrast that with what you understand the EU and the US approaches are.
Sure, I will do. But first, thank you for inviting me on to this panel. It's great to join you this afternoon. So the focus on growth in the UK has largely come about because of the perception of the UK as a destination for foreign direct investment and as a place to do business. And if you speak to those who are close to the current Prime Minister or the Chancellor, one of the things they will tell you is very early on in their time in the new government last year, they were hearing a lot of complaints about how easy it was for businesses to transact in the UK. And there were a lot of complaints in particular about the Competition and Markets Authority. And typically, these complaints came from organisations headquartered outside of the UK and operating globally. And so I think that had an impact on the agenda for the government. They've come out and said growth is their number one priority. And if you think about the last few years, the impact of Brexit has been really important in all of that for two reasons. The first, I think the UK needs to think about how attractive it is as a destination for foreign direct investment, but also the Competition and Markets Authority got some additional tools, or at least its scope to apply tools increased because we detached ourselves from the EU treaties. But let's be clear, the focus on growth and being an attractive destination for foreign direct investment are slightly different things. And it's just curious that this came about because of the perception of foreign companies and their ability to do business in the UK. What the government is asking of the CMA is no different to what previous governments have asked of other sector regulators in the UK, the sector regulator for water, Ofwat, the sector regulator for gas and electricity, Ofgem, and the communications regulator, Ofcom. They have a statutory duty to promote economic growth. The CMA didn't, but now it's had a very strong steer from the government that it should take into account its impact on growth and how it works. And that's largely come about through the strategic steer. I think there was a link put in the chat for those joining the webinar this afternoon. That strategic steer is a lot shorter than ones I've seen in the past and very focused on growth. And for businesses interacting with the CMA, they're likely to see that play out primarily through process, but also then, I think, in time, substantive outcomes. And the CMA, in articulating how it will respond to the government's call for a focus on economic growth, has outlined this 4P framework, which you'll hear Sarah Cardell, the CEO of the CMA, talk a lot about. And the 4Ps are pace, predictability, proportionality, and process. So doing things quickly, being consistent in how they do things and predictable rather than having some surprises along the way, and being proportionate in how they discharge their statutory functions, and really ensuring that the process doesn't sit heavily on the organisations that interact with it. And that focus goes hand in hand with some jurisdictional changes and other legislative changes that have occurred in recent years. So within the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act, there are, for example, changes to legislation that include safe harbours for certain merger transactions that if you're a small digital startup looking to exit, you might benefit from. I think there is a question about whether or not all of this stuff will actually work, whether or not it will lead to higher growth. I personally am a bit sceptical for a few reasons. The purpose of the CMA, if it's done well, should be to promote growth. That's about driving competition in markets and supporting innovative companies to develop and grow. And through the process of competition in markets to weed out those firms that aren't focused on consumers and don't respond well to that dynamism. I think as well, if you look at the broader landscape, the government is a bit inconsistent in its messaging, because at the same time as it's asking the CMA to go for growth, it's also introducing new digital markets regulation, with the CMA as the organisation that will deliver that. And you look across the regulatory landscape, Ofcom, the communications regulator, are doing a lot more in online harms, and in other sectors, the government's introducing regulators. So there is a bit of inconsistency in the landscape in terms of this go for growth message, but also then the extent, the breadth, scale, and extent of regulation in the UK. And when you have these regulatory apparatus, you tend to encourage rent seekers and businesses who don't want to compete on the merits to use regulation as the means by which they grow. And not in all cases. I think, clearly ex-ante regulation can support positive economic outcomes, but you do tend to find where there are sector regulators that companies try and use the regulator to get outcomes that they want rather than compete on the merits. And I expect that we'll see some of that with the Digital Markets Unit. You asked about comparison with other jurisdictions. One thing to draw out about the Digital Markets Unit and the approach of UK regulators is it tends to be more principle-based. So within the legislation that set up the DMU, there's the articulation of the three things that the CMA should promote: fair dealing, open choices, trust and transparency. But the detail of how it does that isn't set out in legislation, and the CMA has to, over a period of time, articulate both through guidance and through its decisions how it will deliver that for firms that it designates with strategic market status. Contrast that to the US, predominantly, if not totally, a judicial system where the government has to litigate to achieve certain outcomes. So a far more judicial process, probably slower, probably fewer cases in the main, and potentially more challenging for the agencies in that system to achieve the outcomes, the policy outcomes they want. And in the EU, similar to the UK, has more ex-ante structures in terms of regulation, but unlike the Anglo approach, which is typically principles-based, the European model tends to prescribe rules, and we've seen that with the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. So setting out up front, here are the things, here are the behaviours or the ways of working that we would like to see, and firms are judged against those rules up front, rather than the principles that you see in the UK approach. So it will be interesting to see as these different models play out over time, which tends to support growth more. Although, and to build on a point that Daniel started to make, I think we in the competition community might like to think that what we do is all that matters when it comes to these broader economic questions, but clearly growth and the dynamism of markets rely on a lot more than just competition policy. For example, education policy, tax policy, immigration policy, and so on, all play into whether or not a country has dynamic and growing markets, particularly in the digital space. And I suspect they will end up mattering a bit more than precisely what process the CMA adopts for its regulation in digital markets or beyond.
Thank you very much, Alexander, especially to situate the possible impact that the new rules in the UK might have on the overall agenda of growth, and recognizing that this is just a subset of a larger environment. Thank you for your remarks. Super interesting. And I would like now to turn to Rory. Rory O'Donoghue, who's with Google and Global Competition. Rory, what are your views from Google about first of all, if you could summarize to us what you think Google is doing to promote growth, and to stimulate growth, and explain to us how you guys are innovating or enabling others to innovate within digital markets. And perhaps we could end with asking you how you think you are addressing the concerns that the CMA may have.
Thank you, Annabelle, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to platform leaders for this opportunity. I'm in a really fortunate position for this question, working at Google, to speak about kind of our role in growth. And I think I would look at kind of, first of all, to the first part of your question, kind of Google's role in encouraging growth in the UK. From our latest figures, Google's products, so Search, Android, and other products generate over £110 billion worth of economic activity in the UK. The Android app economy supports almost 500,000 jobs and nearly £10 billion in annual revenue for British developers. And we have extensive training programs in the UK, encouraging startups, encouraging people to retrain and reskill in the new digital skills, which encourages growth. So I think Google is a significant contributor to growth. But I also think when we look at innovation and unlocking productivity growth in the UK, again, that's somewhere where Google is really fortunate. I'm really kind of privileged and still a bit confused as to how I work at a company that has 2 Nobel Prize winners in its Google DeepMind operations, generating AlphaFold, which has got over 2 million users in almost 200 countries, using that for unlocking health developments and advances. But this isn't just about kind of Google's products, and I think Google is, as it was mentioned by Daniel, one of those companies that invests incredibly heavily in research and development. I think our latest figures that Sundar spoke about is that we've invested almost $150 billion in research and development in the last 5 years. We've released publicly over 1,000 pieces of research to make publicly available for researchers and for other developers. It's a story that I like to say is that the T in ChatGPT stands for the transformer, which is referring back to a paper that Google released in 2017. So kind of Google research unlocking a whole swathe of developments that we've seen across the board. And I think, through our investments, through our breakthrough innovations, as well as our kind of supporting of open source research and trainings, I think we are really supporting growth and innovation across the UK. And I think that will be really, really important as we kind of go forward in the AI revolution and seeing the opportunities that AI has for unlocking economic growth, which the government, with its AI strategy, recognised very early on in the term of this government, as previous governments did in the UK as well. I think to the second part of your question, Annabelle, which was about kind of regulatory approaches and the CMA's concerns, I think the first piece to recognise is that we are obviously currently engaging with the CMA as part of a number of investigations under the new Digital Markets Act. So I'm not going to comment specifically on kind of those investigations, although we have talked publicly about kind of our constructive engagement with the CMA. But I think to both Daniel's point and to Alex's points, when we look at economic growth and when we look at competition regulation specifically, I think it's important to recognize the trade-offs that come from any regulations. We at Google have seen in other jurisdictions that kind of onerous prescriptive regimes can have negative consequences for users and for innovation. Alex mentioned the kind of Mario Draghi report about how regulation in the EU, not just competition regulation, but kind of the collective weight of regulations can slow that innovation in Europe. And I think it's really, really, really important that when we think about these new processes and new regimes, that we think about the user benefit, the growth benefit, and the innovation impacts that this can have. But when we speak about kind of AI innovation that we're seeing a lot of at the moment in digital markets, I think there's 2 points that I think we should note for this ecosystem. The first is the competitive landscape that we're seeing at the moment. AI is now creating competition at every level of the AI stack, from the funding layer to chip design and manufacture, to the compute infrastructure, to the talent, model sizes, deployment, use cases. There is vast amounts of competition across the AI stack. The venture capitalist Mary Meeker said that this is unprecedented in her time following tech developments over 30 years. I think she used that word 51 times in her report recently in viewing the kind of digital landscape. So we can see this competition is robust with many choices. And so when regulators are analyzing this, I think that needs to be seen, that the dynamic nature of the market is 2022 looks very, very different to 2025. And I'm sure 2026 will look very, very different to this time. We simply don't know where the next innovation and breakthrough is going to come from. And I think when we talk about regulatory approaches, kind of recognizing this uncertainty, that we think policymakers should, of course, look at the best ways to regulate. We think that AI is too important not to regulate, but too important not to regulate correctly, and that policymakers should be looking more at a risk-based approach, looking at the outputs of this and taking it as a sector by sector basis. And also looking not just at regulation, but also, how can AI growth be encouraged through supporting infrastructure, through supporting research and development, skills and retraining, and adoption and implementation by business. That will be important to unlocking the types of growth that the UK government wants. And I'm very proud that Google plays a constructive role across all of these conversations with the UK government, as well as with businesses and other stakeholders.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And thank you for summarizing the role that Google is playing in investing a lot in R&D and stimulating growth. We still have a few minutes, and so I wanted to open up the discussion. So for those of you who want to put their questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. But I wanted to bring your insights together, and I had a question for the panel, and please feel free, any one of you, to comment on it. We've heard from Daniel in the beginning of the session that there's something unique, there's something specific about those digital markets. And we all understand that, under some circumstances, that monopolization can become an outcome that happens naturally. We understand that scale, and along with network effects, can create self-fulfilling trajectories of growth for a company. And we understand at the same time that those companies who have reached these positions of being very large, very central platforms to ecosystems, they do a lot of innovation. On the other hand, traditional economic theory tends to envision a market renewing themselves by new entrants coming in and disrupting the existing equilibrium of incumbents, that is, dethroning previous incumbents. And I wonder what the panel's views are as to whether they think this is still possible in the digital markets when the advantages of incumbency are so large that allow central big tech platforms in particular to acquire, to make systematic acquisition of potential new entrants on the one hand, and on the other hand, to choose business models where, we were just hearing about AI, they could choose to subsidize those AI features to most users, rendering very difficult for other companies to actually make profits and capture value out of selling those services if they are bundled in a free way by existing incumbents. So I'd love to hear your views as to how, in summary, the specificities of the digital markets and structured along platforms and ecosystems might create challenges for growth, in particular in terms of allowing entry and growth of new players.
Annabelle, I'm happy to have a go to start, and I might focus on a particular type of platform, which is those that are advertising funded. I've long held the view that regulators get it wrong when it comes to advertising funded platforms. I think there's a lot of focus on the product side and whether or not there are platforms that exist that do similar functional things for consumers, and they spend a bit less time looking at the advertising side. But if you look at advertising funded platforms and the flow of funds, what are advertisers interested in? Well, online, it's typically purchasing intent and getting their advert in front of people who are likely to act on it. And they're probably more agnostic as to whether or not that advert is served on a particular type of platform that does a certain type of thing or another. But as soon as a better platform comes along for achieving what they're trying to achieve, that money will flow in a different direction. So the competition for that spend plays out at a slightly different level than that which most regulators focus on, which is not firms that look exactly alike on the product side competing with each other, but actually firms that offer advertisers better versions of what they're trying to achieve competing. And I think if some of the new AI models develop in a way where they offer something compelling to advertisers, and we're seeing early product launches that are more in the subscription based arena, then it's quite conceivable that some of the large platforms that have existed for a large part of the last 10 to 20 years and relied on advertising money start to see that money move away into these new products and services. So is that a bad thing? Is that a good thing? Is the regulatory focus on the right thing? And I raised that as a specific example of where regulators might be misdirecting themselves as to the competition that ultimately matters, and it may not be between firms that look the same, but actually platforms and other organizations that are innovating and developing the next technological leap. I'm simplifying a lot there. There's a lot more nuance. I've no doubt that people would object to the general view, but I offer that as an example.
Very helpful. Very helpful. Thank you. Rory or Daniel, would you like to comment on?
I'm happy to add something. I mean,
yes.
I think there have been winner takes all argument. There's a winner takes all dynamics here in these sectors, and that's something that has been very hard to escape. As Alex has just said, there is a paradigm shift going on at the moment, which is fascinating to see. Probably pretty stressful for people like Rory to be living alongside, but that's the nature of competition. And just going back to your opening remarks, sort of just the question you're asking. I mean, you're right. I mean, if we look way back in time, we sort of Google replaced Yahoo. Some of us could even remember Ask Jeeves and things like that, right? But those sorts of things haven't happened for years and years and years, and that's what made people think about, well, where is something really harmful going on for competition? But equally, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that shares are changing and that new entrants are taking over for a market to be contestable. Because it just needs to be the potential for that to happen, and that it's incentivizing incumbents, and incumbents are acting in a sufficient, in a competitive way by maintaining, if they're in that position, put it this way, they have a balance of options. They can either innovate and make sure they stay really strong and good so they're not replaced, or they can, these are not exclusive, but they can also do what they can to curb legitimate competition, i.e. others offering good, useful services that might even be better. And that is the challenge, in a really, really crudely put, that needs to be struck. Now, the reason that the EU and the UK decided we needed to go towards an ex-ante regime, i.e. setting rules up front, was because when you've got that, if those are the sorts of issues you're challenged by, you can't rely on standard ex-post competition law. So standard competition law basically says, broadly, markets work well. There might be a glitch every now and again. There might be a cartel. There might be an abuse of behavior by a dominant firm. But if you stop that happening, if you break that legal arrangement, or if you address that abuse of dominance, the market goes back to, it self-corrects. It goes back to a competitive dynamic. That's not the case when it comes to monopolies, right? Traditional monopolies. So that's why we've got ex ante regulation when it comes to network monopolies, because you end up in a whack-a-mole regime. And that's where we were with the platforms. If you're enforcing against the platforms, you say, look, there's a problem going on here. We'll use ex post competition law. So we'll get this platform for its abusive of dominant behavior. But you're not addressing the problem at core or opening up competition. You're just potentially moving it on to another area. So that's why an ex ante regime is, I liked how Alex compared the DMA and the DMU, because the benefits of the DMA are predictability. Ironically, one of the CMA's 4 Ps, but the challenges of it are that it can over-intervene by putting a one-size-fits-all rules-prescribed basis. But equally, going back to my earlier points, if the CMA is going to deliver on that and rely on its proportionality P in doing that, it needs really to sort of think, well, let's not just take a crude approach, mimic the DMA, or do just a simplistic approach. Let's actually understand what's going on with this particular platform, where the problem lies, and how we preserve its innovation incentives and its willingness to and its ability to innovate, alongside encouraging entry where that is healthy, and when that could be a very legitimate challenge, and lead to that old dynamic that we used to see.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel. Rory, would you like to add to that? And I think then we will conclude the session.
No, I think I agree with a lot of points that have been made. I would just say the shift that we're seeing in the ecosystem at the moment is very significant. I did a quick search just before this panel, and the news that's been announced is that OpenAI have already announced a 50% growth in the number of business users that they have to their subscription platform. The Perplexity is now valued at $14 billion already. And there are a rumored distribution deal with Samsung that some papers are reporting on. Those are the types of new entrants that we're seeing in the market, growing at an unprecedented rate. I think OpenAI got to 1 billion kind of users quicker than any other piece of technology ever. There's kind of, you can see the charts on this. So I think the nature of competition across the AI stack is enormous. But I also think the changing way that people are interacting with these new services means that the way that we view disruption or the way we view market entry is very different now. And I think that is only going to change as this develops even further. So I would say that competition in this space is as robust as it's ever been. And I appreciate Daniel noting that Google are also responding in kind of innovating to match this changing consumer behavior.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And so I think we will conclude this panel now, and I will say over to you, Laure.
Thank you very much, Annabelle, and thank you, Rory, Alexander, and Daniel, for this really interesting panel. So let's move to our next panel, Building a Moat in an AI-Driven World. So we've been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years at Launchworks & Co. on how to embed AI into platforms and more generally organizations. And what we've seen is that AI redefines the rules of competition, as was mentioned in the previous panel. AI is both disrupting and accelerating businesses, and we'll talk about the impact of AI on service marketplaces today and how you can create a moat and avoid disruption. So let me introduce our panel of experts. Tito Unda is a serial entrepreneur. He was at Job&Talent for almost 10 years. Job&Talent is a global marketplace that connects individuals with employment opportunities. And Tito was, until very recently, VP of Product. Sébastien de Lafond is also a serial entrepreneur. He's the co-founder and CEO of Edumapper, a marketplace which helps students compare and choose higher education programs. Sébastien was previously co-founder and CEO of Meilleurs Agents, a real estate platform acquired by Axel Springer. And Sébastien is the author of the excellent book telling the story of Meilleurs Agents, On voit bien que vous n'y connaissez rien. And last but not least, Jeremy Gottschalk, co-founder and CEO of Marketplace Risk, the global platform resource for anything related to risk management, trust and safety, regulatory compliance of digital platforms. Jeremy is the author of bulletproof your marketplace, and I recommend his book if you haven't grabbed a copy yet. So welcome, everyone. So let's start with AI in practice and examples of real-life use cases of how to leverage the power of AI. So Sébastien, I'm going to start with you. Could you say a bit more about your AI-powered marketplaces, so both Meilleurs Agents and Edumapper?
Hi, Laure. Hello, everyone. You hear me properly?
Perfect.
Excellent. Yes, I've had the chance of being involved in two different marketplaces addressing, two important aspects of our life. One is real estate and the second is education. In the first place, Meilleurs Agents was there to try to correct an asymmetry in the information asymmetry in the marketplace, trying to help consumers make better decisions when they buy and sell property. And we wanted to build transparency in real estate prices and transparency also in the competence of real estate agents. To do that, we had to build a large database of information and transform this data, which was difficult to access, raw data on transaction prices, into proper estimates. So people willing to estimate their property online could do so. And in 2008, that was a huge task. In the US, those data and those solutions were readily available, with the example of Zillow. But in a market like France, where access to information was way more difficult, that was, I guess, an enormous task. And over the years, we started to build machine learning techniques so that we could compensate the fact that we didn't have access to all the transaction information, and we could aggregate unpure data sources that we could transform into intelligent telling market information thanks to ML. And that was like 15 years ago, using tools like CatBoost, that tells something to some people. And we could transform listings into proper information sources, despite the fact that when you have listings, you don't have proper address information. You lack data, but we could analyze images so that we could get information on construction dates, and through triangulation, get a good sense of where that property was located. And that could help us build some price maps, which were very comparable to what Zillow did, with much better information. And this is where I would say ancient, or the initial approach to what we would not call AI at the time, but machine learning and deep learning, could lead to better information despite difficult access to data. At the time, AI was not a threat, it was an enabler. Today, and I will pass the baton to the other speakers, with the new platform, which aim is to help high school students choose their higher education options. Here again, we are trying to build transparency on an opaque, in an opaque environment. Access to information is also very difficult. AI is everywhere, helping us categorize information which we have to scrap or access through open source and but so the tools today are way more powerful, but at the same time, the threat that the big players in AI could be to our model, I guess, compensate for the strengths of the tools that we use today. So the battle pretty much is the same, is the question of AI as an enabler versus AI as a threat Today, the threat is bigger, whereas the tools are faster and stronger. But at the end of the day, we'll have to make our business defensible, which is going to be some challenge.
We're going to move on to that very soon. So, Tito, what's the mission of Job&Talent, and how big is the marketplace today?
Good. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Job&Talent mission is basically to empower essential workers. So by essential workers, we mean all that people that actually keep the world spinning: hospitality, logistics, light industry. So the Job&Talent marketplace employs roughly 300,000 people a year. It's important to address the fact that it's a staffing marketplace. So we actually act as the employers of record, right? It's not just that we help workers find that job, but we accompany as employers those workers all throughout their journey with our clients. For us, AI has played a very key role, especially in the last 12 months or so. We also were one of those that thought that we were getting late to the party, but it's true that we speed things up. And in a matter of a few months, I would say that we sync our watches with the rest of the world in terms of delivering AI products within the marketplace. We've used AI all across the journey, from the more basic machine learning opportunities on the algorithm side to fine-tune and optimize the matching piece, but also AI to curate content, right, on the marketplace. And lately, we've invested a lot in AI agents, right? In the end, our marketplace is a people marketplace. So we realized that on many occasions it was faster and better for workers and for that people to actually talk with an agent or over the phone, or rather than having to fill in information on an interface and things like that. So we deployed AI agents across the journey. I believe at the moment we have like 5 different agents, from more of a recruitment agent to another agent which is acts as a trainer and calls the workers every single week to understand any performance issues, give them feedback, and so it's been challenging, of course, also considering the fact that we are live in 10 countries. There are completely different regulations when it comes to AI, but also data protection, languages, etc. But I would say that it's been easier than expected. I would say, like, it's true that sometimes it feels overwhelming, AI, and you have the feeling that you never really catch up with it. Like, there are news around AI every single day, but once you get to it, I would say it's pretty rewarding. Like, if in a very short period of time, you start getting and seeing the benefits of having moved to an AI-driven world.
So could you remind us the GMV of Job&Talent so that people realize how big it is? And could you describe how Job&Talent integrated AI agents? How quickly did you manage to implement this, and what were the key outcomes?
It's a 2.2 billion GMV. Actually, our GMV for us is pure revenue. We transact the whole GMV that goes through the platform. I would say that, for instance, one of the things that was clear for us is that integration of those agents was the last thing that we did. So we first start testing, even if it was manually, like getting data from our platform, from our marketplace, downloading that data, and then trying out different approaches and see what was the behavior that we're getting from the user, and being super user-centric, because in the end you're also changing a behavior on the users that have been used to getting a phone call from a human or getting a notification, an email, filling in a form, and all of a sudden you're changing the game. So it's important that your user-based reacts properly. And I would say that we've been pretty much focused on making sure that we nail the experience first and then walk it backwards to, okay, then let's now integrate it so that we could scale it, right? And I would say that approach has really been really powerful for us to make sure that at the moment of integrating and making the hard decisions of of integrations, we had a very clear understanding that that was already working, and it was just a matter of scaling it. So I
And
would say starting in
how
the
many?
summer, mostly we started in the summer playing around with AI agents, and the first one it took 2 months to run the early pilots, and then we started scaling already. So by November, we already had the main agent in place. And it's true that once you do it, you do it once, you build your own playbook, and then from going from one agent to 5 agents total, it's been almost deploying a new agent every single month.
So it's been quite a quick journey. That's impressive. Moving on to you, Jeremy, how has AI changed your work with marketplaces in your area?
So from kind of a regulatory perspective, it's interesting and important to keep in mind that for the first 20 years of the internet, it went largely unregulated, right? We've now experienced the negative side of the internet, the fraud, abuse, online harms, and then of course the pendulum is now swinging, and AI is right in the crosshairs of regulators all over the world. So now you're seeing, and I think somebody mentioned this on the last panel, I would argue a complete overregulation to the point that in the US, we've got almost every state with AI bills and regulators and legislators who don't understand that the internet and artificial intelligence doesn't honor boundaries and jurisdictions. So just from a very high level perspective, we're seeing just a ton more regulation, and unfortunately, even for some of the best technologists, right? We can't all comprehend everything about AI, and you've got people who understand even less regulating it. So we're going into a little bit of a regulatory Wild West. But when I think about kind of my day-to-day, and you think about data privacy, data security, liability, intellectual property ownership, kind of the liability and exposure that comes with operating a platform, the question really becomes like, how is AI going to impact that, right? So the information that you are consuming, who owns that? The output, who owns that? What happens when there are hallucinations or you get some content generated that is inappropriate? Unfortunately, right now, so those are the questions that are coming up on a regular basis. Unfortunately, right now, the cases in the US are just making their way through the courts. So there's not a lot of good precedent. US Copyright Office, for example, is signaling that nobody owns what is generated from AI tools or engines. And so the questions that I get from kind of an internal perspective is, when the developers use these AI tools, do we own the code? Do we have any intellectual property rights in it? Is it protectable? And so kind of every aspect, AI is truly touching every aspect of kind of my daily work. The unfortunate response is more often than not like, we're not quite sure, but kind of here's our best guess. And of course, we're tracking the regulations and the legislation through the courts just to give some indication, because it'll be a few years before we have solid information to really give good advice and counsel.
Thank you, Jeremy. So, I mean, I've said, AI is really changing the rules of competition, and so the question becomes, how do you defend your business? We all remember Chegg, the tutoring marketplace. It was valued at $12 billion in 2021. And so when ChatGPT launched in November 22, it significantly disrupted Chegg's business model, because Chegg lost most of its traffic as students were asking their questions to ChatGPT instead. And so by November 2024, Chegg's stock had declined by 99% from its peak. So it's quite a dramatic decline. So I have a question for you, Sébastien and Tito, and perhaps you can take it in turn. As founders building AI-powered marketplaces, how do you ensure that your business remains defensible, and especially against powerful generalist AI platforms like ChatGPT?
Yeah, it's a super important question, and we're not sure we can answer it, but we need to ask this question to ourselves, because if we don't, then the market will answer at our place. So In our case, building Edumapper, which is this education platform, we are trying to provide an answer to those future students who are wondering which courses, which school they should join. So what best place rather than ChatGPT to start asking that question? And if the platform, our platform, is not able to provide a better answer than ChatGPT, let's give up today. So the question, how do we build something that will last and that will build value over time and be able to fence off the ChatGPTs of this world in the next 5 and 10 years? I think some of the answers to that is we need to first build the first and proprietary database that is not replicable. And many of the things that we do are replicable, like open source data, that websites that can be scrapped. We do that. ChatGPT will do that way faster than us. But there are other sources that we will be able to aggregate through network effects, through the contribution of our customers, schools and courses, and users of the platforms, communities around the platform, and they will contribute to building that database that will be our own first. So that's a proprietary database. Second is building expert solutions with a lot of science embedded in them. And being the specialist and the absolute expert in your field, I think, is absolutely key, because there will be some domains in which the ChatGPT of this world will not be able to invest as deeply as you and then provide as fine, as precise answers. And for subjects that are not mundane, like, okay, next movie, which is the next movie or next dish or next restaurant I should pick? It's about my education for the next 3 or 5 years. That's an important question, like health. You will want to have the most reliable and serious answer. So being an expert and doing deep research, I think, is one of the answers. Building brand around that is important so that people associate your brand to that reliability and specialization. And maybe at the end of the day, also some hybridation between a fully digital platform and some human interaction. It may not apply to all service platforms, but in our case, we will inject some human interaction, human advice in that very important, aspect of our life, which is higher education orientation. So that would be my initial answer.
What about you, Tito?
I definitely agree with Sebastian's comments. In the end, it's all about going back to the basics, right? Which are the best marketplace? The ones that have good supply, right? Enough liquidity, and that the liquidity they've got is quality, right? And that connects with what Sebastian was having, like, hey, not just having access to all that information, but also making sure that it's good information, but also making sure that there is trust on that information and building on the flywheel effect of a marketplace, of getting reviews or whatever helps, so that in the end you really become a trustworthy marketplace. I do believe that it's true that marketplaces that are based on knowledge, right, and knowledge that it could be accessible, but things like Check, for instance, right, or the challenge that Sebastian has with Edumapper, they have a bigger challenge as when it comes to competing with ChatGPTs of the world, because in the end they basically gather and simplify and summarize for us all that knowledge. But there are many marketplaces that are on a different battle. Like for Job&Talent, in the end we sell people's time. So in the end, what is it that your market provides, right, for your clients? If it's just knowledge, then it's going to be tricky. And then, as Sebastian said, you have to really focus on building that trust, having access to information that no one has, etc. If it's not just knowledge, then it's true that it could happen the same thing that happened with Check. In the end, you had individuals offering a service, and all of a sudden, that service is also provided by an AI, right? So you have two options: either give up, or also migrate and transform your business from a marketplace to a SaaS, And instead, your clients were going to check because they were finding there a solution to their pain, which was finding the knowledge, right, to solve specific problems. If now that knowledge is on an AI, perhaps you don't need a supply of people providing the knowledge, and it's an AI, right? But you could still, the demand still exists, the pain still exists, and you've become an expert on that field. So it might be that instead of still being a marketplace where individuals get to offer that service, it's more of a SaaS approach in which you become a product, and clients will still go to your place, not to find someone to get that service done, but to use a product that also gets that same service done.
Very interesting. So we talked about, building your own data, proprietary data. From your perspective, Jeremy, what advice would you give to marketplaces to leverage their proprietary data effectively and avoid becoming easily replaceable?
I think it's certainly easier said than done. The reality is if you're leveraging these AI tools, all of the information and content that you input becomes essentially in the public domain, right? So you've got to segregate. If it's truly proprietary, you have to be careful. And so I think as an organization, organizations have to be aware about what tools their developers are using, for example. And to the extent that you have information that is not publicly available, segregating that, keeping that out of the public domain. The other thing, and this is more of a business, I think, response is, developing partnerships with sources of information that isn't otherwise publicly available, because once it's out there, and there's no putting the horse back in the barn. And so it's really kind of a top-down approach, understanding kind of the rights or loss of rights that go along with using some of these public tools. And as an organization, what's acceptable and what's not? What information do you want out there, and what don't you want out there? And then the other thing I will say too, and I think that this was hit on, but even if you're using all publicly available data, training these models for your specific use case, I think, is going to be where some win and others lose, because I've seen a lot of marketplaces just integrating tools like ChatGPT, and they're not training it, they're doing nothing. The context remains kind of the same. And so I think really kind of building on these tools, trying to segregate your data, keep as much of it confidential, I think gives you a little bit of a moat. But as we talked about when we were preparing for this call, the reality is once the data is even in these tools or even before, it could be scraped. So it's really hard unless you've taken really strong measures to keep it segregated.
Thank you, Jeremy. So let's move on to how to manage risks, and let's talk about regulation a little bit. But first of all, looking at the risks, and the question for you, Sébastien, because you might have lots of biases in AI data as well as you have in real life. So how do you plan to manage the risks associated with AI bias? As you provide recommendations, or as students look for recommendations for courses, how do you ensure that your platform's recommendations remain fair and trustworthy going forward?
That's going to be a challenge and an important point for us, because we built that platform to foster equality of chances in a domain where access to the proper information is clearly biasing the trajectories of future students. So those that have the chances of being surrounded by people in the know, contrary to those that are remote from decision centers, from the people with the right information. The platform is there to provide some level playing field, and to provide the best information and the best access and the best opportunities to all, providing that the AI that will be sitting on top of our database will not be itself biased, because as we train AI, and our agents, we could reproduce some of the, I guess, trajectories which we see in our societies without actually realizing it. And we will have to, I guess, ethically control the way that our agent works so that we don't reproduce the things that we're fighting against. So it will have to be a fine-tuned AI built on top of our proprietary database. And that's absolutely key, because if you cannot trust that this AI is benevolent, unbiased, then the whole trust in the platform will disappear. So that's absolutely key to us. It's not a question of how powerful this AI will be, it's how ethical it is. Now, it will take us some time with our scientists and researchers to build that. So it's something for the next 2 or 3 years for us. It's not a current issue. It's something that we have to plan ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Sébastien. And Tito, could you provide examples of how Job&Talent migrated potential AI risks, especially when scaling rapidly?
One of the things that we did is to leverage on more AI to mitigate that risk. And actually, for instance, we had use cases in which we had voice agents doing lots of calls. And of course, even though you have the data, we were getting all the transcripts so that you could really monitor and understand word by word what's going on those calls, which, first point, is way much more data than what we were getting when we had humans having those interactions. But it was overwhelming, too much data. So we put a team auditing random samples of those calls. Of course, too much, right? So what do? We put another AI actually checking those transcripts to detect the anomalies, and then get the team, the humans, to review only the anomalies that were detected. So you could also leverage AI to do that, to improve your whole monitorization and auditing process, right? And also the fact that sometimes being able to enforce policies, it's easier with AI than with humans, because with humans you train them, you repeat the policies over and over again, you have your governance process, etc. But with AI, you could be strict on the prompting to make sure that that happens the way you want it to happen, right? For instance, on a use case, we do lots of recruitment. So similar to what Sébastien was doing, we want equal opportunities. I mean, there are some non-discrimination acts on several countries, right? And we wanted to really completely eliminate that bias. And even though we were enforcing a policy with our recruiters, human recruiters, to make sure that that was not happening, can I ensure 100% that wasn't happening ever? No, right? Because that's humans. But with AI, we actually ensure that the AI was not even able, like there was a hard-coded statement in the prompt that says, do not consider the accent of the person, because we don't really care about the nationality of the worker. So don't even factor it in the equation. That's the thing that is also important. Like, what you don't tell the AI, then the AI is gonna always go further. I always say that AI is like a super energized intern. So he lots of power. They are gonna do lots of. They really want to show them off, to really impress, demonstrate. But you have to set proper guardrails, because if you don't, then they're gonna go to dark places you don't really want them to go. So it's important that you not only define what you want that AI to do, but it's as important to define what you don't want that AI to do.
That's very good advice. And today it's an intern, and tomorrow it might be a senior contributor as AI improves. So Jeremy, what are the key regulatory and liability challenges marketplaces face when integrating AI, and particularly with your expertise in trust and safety? What have you seen, and what are you seeing right now? You're on mute, Jeremy.
Sorry about that. I think that, as I mentioned before, I mean, the key regulatory challenges are complete inconsistency right now. And also, the best intentioned politicians will get it wrong. And so we're all, it's like a Wild West situation where it's nearly impossible to advise people. It's kind of like, listen, play with it. I'll let you know when we learn something. But there's not a lot from a regulatory. There's a lot happening, but not a lot in it's kind of in practice. But from a trust and safety perspective, we're trying to figure out both how we can leverage AI, and we are seeing how AI tools can detect fraud and abuse and online harms faster. But the bad guys are way ahead of the good guys. And so there are actually tools being built, which I will not mention, but to basically, master account takeover, account creation, profile creation. I mean, fraud at an exponential rate, and humans certainly can't keep up. So AI tools are being leveraged to kind of identify when or detect when other fraudulent or fraud-producing tools are being used. And then you've got like the hallucinations, right? Who's responsible when that happens, and defamation. And just last week, ChatGPT won a defamation lawsuit, which is really encouraging because there's, no AI tool is ever going to be perfect. And so we have to really consider, the internet and marketplaces have proliferated in large part because they have not been responsible for every single thing that's happened between their users or as a result of the users. And so kind of keeping our eye on that, and how do we leverage AI both to keep people safe, but also protect from and identify and mitigate the fraud and abuse and the online harms.
Thank you, Jeremy. Now, and it's a question to all of you. If you could give one piece of advice to a marketplace founder embarking on their AI or entrepreneurial journey, what would it be? Who wants to go first?
I'll start that one.
Yeah.
I always tell them go for it, right? And they always, the lawyer is always, not always, but most often seen as the profit killer, the deal killer, the innovation killer. And, as a business lawyer, my answer is always yes, and we'll figure out how after the fact, right? It's kind of like shoving your foot in your mouth, which I do on a constant basis. But the answer in this case always has to be yes, because you have to learn, they have to tinker, they have to test. And kind of learn as much as you can. The other thing is, I've seen some really cool company-wide policies where they're requiring every employee to play with a tool for an hour a week or 2 hours a week. And truly, I mean, if you look like in China, for example, right, AI is has become part of the education. So I think from an organizational perspective, you got to go for it. Stay away from overly cautious lawyers. And pay attention to what's going on with the regulations and kind of as litigation works its way.
Sébastien.
I guess that the image that comes to my mind is the one about dancing with the bear. The bear is there. You're in the woods with the bear because you've decided to build a platform. So dealing with the bear is not an option. It's there. So I guess you have to leverage the formidable strengths of that bear, and it's a formidable opportunity. But you have to be aware also that if you're not prudent, it could tear your head off. So it's dancing with the bear. It will take some skill, but you don't have an option. I think it's fascinating. Buyers beware.
Very wise word. Thank you, Sébastien. What about you, Tito?
Well, of course, agreeing with everything that Jeremy and Sébastien said, but I think it's important to not to lose focus and understand that AI is a method, is a tool, it's a goal. So it's still a marketplace is about GMV, liquidity, whichever is your North Star. And you have to then understand how could AI contribute to that goal, right? But I see in tech lots of, now we're gonna put AI somewhere in the closer to the logo or AI powered or whatever. But in the end, there's lots of marketing around AI. So let's make sure that AI in your company is not just marketing and is really delivering an outcome that has an impact on your P&L.
Thank you. Just looking at the the chat. There is one interesting question from Alex, who's asking, what's the balance between brand equity versus the business model in a context of a marketplace where you have network effects? Anyone wants to take this one?
It's a tough one. As far as we are concerned, we know that building trust from our end users will be key to aggregating user-generated content. So launching those network effects will be key so that we have a defensible set of data. And we have that if we have brand. So the two are totally, I guess, interdependent. The question is, how do we kickstart the process so that we start building that trust and start to launch those network effects so that people contribute? And the more of that we do, the stronger our position will be in the market. But at the end of the day, we should never lose the trust of our users because that's our key currency.
Yeah,
Excellent.
not much to add. No, I mean, I fully agree. In the end, brand is just communicating what you're doing, but first you have to do, right? The brand effect will eventually come, but first you really have to generate trust on the existing users that they already know you, and that's what really will build the intangible of the brand equity over time.
Last word, Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, it's all connected, right? I mean, I think that there was a recent case of, you're seeing AI powered everywhere, and the reality is it's not true. And I don't remember what the development firm was. I'm drawing a blank now, but it turns out they didn't have any AI at all. They had all these developers in India kind of on the back, and so. It's interesting because AI is not only a buzzword, it's a hugely powerful tool. Silicon Valley is just feeding this. And so the amount of times I've heard AI razzle dazzle added on top is like, it's kind of one of the new buzzwords, but I think it's really important, right? Your North Star, your customers, making sure that it fits into your business, the services, and not kind of the cart before the horse or cart leading the horse, because I think that there's a real tendency, particularly in the tech world, to just follow the buzzwords and for funding and to see where they go.
Exactly. And I think you're referring to Builder.ai. It's a fascinating story, if you haven't read about it yet, where they had actually thousands of small little hands in a building, actually answering questions as if it was an AI engine. So I found this story absolutely fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I really think we're gonna get a Netflix documentary pretty soon.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely worthy. So thank you very much, Sébastien, Tito, and Jeremy, for this fascinating discussion.
Absolutely.
So we're now going to move to our last session, the wrap-up of the day, and let me introduce Benoît Reillier. So Benoît is Platform Leaders co-chair. He's the co-founder and CEO of Launchworks & Co. and the co-author of Platform Strategy. And you'd be glad to know that Benoît and I are working on a new edition of the book, which will be released sometime next year. So I am now going to hand over to Benoît.
Thank you, Laure. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, even for those of you who are on a different time zone. So today we covered 3 topics. We talked about misinformation, we talked about regulation for growth, and we talked about the impact of AI on businesses. So I'd like to take a few minutes to revisit these 3 topics. I mean, first, Marshall van Alstyne, who is one of the foremost experts on digital platforms in the world, really, and on misinformation, invited us to think about misinformation as a type of market failure. So what is a market failure? A market failure is something that impacts you negatively, but that you're not responsible for. So pollution was used as a great analogy. The problem with market failure, by definition, is that it doesn't correct itself. So Marshall is proposing to introduce a range of incentives within the system so that people can basically put a stake to signal the veracity of their content. And there's a mechanism within the ecosystem to check this and to basically amplify information that is accurate, has got a high quality, and maybe dampen the broadcasting of the information that is of low quality. So this is a very interesting mechanism. Clearly, this is at the research stage, but we happen to believe that it would be great to actually experiment on this. And if a social network is out there thinking about how to develop a competitive advantage in that field, something that is valuable, rare, difficult to imitate, I think a platform that would have very low misinformation and very high quality information would probably do very well. Also clearly of interest to policymakers within the platform leaders community. So if you have questions, feel free to get in touch, and we'll connect you with Marsha. So very interesting first session. Then we talked about how to regulate for growth. So regulating for growth really is a relevant concept, a relevant topic around the world, but it's especially important for the UK government, who has issued very clear instructions, so-called steer, to all the regulators to make sure that they take growth seriously, I think in the words of our Prime Minister. And the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority, is in charge of the regulation of digital markets, and clearly they take notice of these steers and instructions, and it will be really interesting to see how that plays out. Now, Daniel Gordon reminded us of the importance of economic growth, and he brought to bear his dual perspective, because he worked both at the Treasury on macroeconomic growth and innovation, and also at the CMA at the micro end of the market, looking after competition and how firms behave. And he reminded us that many of the tools in the toolbox for these regulators were in fact tools that were developed for static markets. So that's these may not be the best tools to bring to bear in the context of highly dynamic environments. So maybe the job of regulators is a bit more difficult than initially thought. We also heard from Alex Baker at Fingleton, who clearly has his finger on the pulse on these issues, and told us that foreign direct investment was an important ingredient for the government in the UK, and clearly potentially one of the elements that were taken into account when these instructions were given to various government departments and regulators. So of course that investment is important for growth, and the UK is sort of in a unique position. The EU is adopting an ex-ante rule-based regulatory framework with the DMA and the DSA. The US clearly is more of a judicial market that happens to, basically litigation largely determines the outcomes. And the UK is in the middle with a principle-based framework, and codes of conduct in the case of the sort of DMA. So it will be interesting to see how these play out, even though clearly competition and regulation is only one ingredient in the mix that brings about innovation. So interesting to hear Rory as well talk about what all the things that Google are doing, and you won't be surprised to hear that of course Google is a big actor in the economy and contributing hundreds of billions to the economic activity here in the UK. And Rory reminded us that Google keeps on innovating. I think he mentioned a paper that was co-authored by 8 Google researchers The paper is titled, it's basically Attention is All You Need. It's a 2017 paper about transformers, and then that's really what brought about the explosion of generative AI services that we see today, and more recently, clearly, Denis Hassabis also got a Nobel Prize, not in AI, interestingly, the Nobel Prize in chemistry, but clearly it's for his work on AI that allowed to better understand the structure and how you fold proteins. So Google, we understand, still very much at the forefront of innovation. We then moved on to our last panel to talk about the impact of AI on businesses. And in particular, we looked at a number of service platforms. So Laure masterfully managed this panel, and we heard Sébastien Lafond, who has worked at Meilleurs Agents and now Edumapper. And both platforms are effectively helping people make the right decisions on things that are very important in life, in which kind of education you choose and what kind of real estate you end up acquiring, big high stakes events in one's life, and told us how he was thinking about creating a competitive advantage. How do you get defensible data assets? And it could be by leveraging your community, unique relationships with data providers. How do you build expert capabilities that are focused on your area, so you're not exposed to the generic models, or not as exposed? Maybe adding a little bit of of course, the brand and things like that, but maybe adding a little bit of human touch as well could help you create something unique in that field. So we look forward to see Edumapper develop its AI capabilities going forward. Now, Tito Unda told us about his experience at Jobs&Talent, so very large staffing marketplace, and Tito actually rolled out not only AI throughout the company, but AI agents for some of the key processes within the platform, like recruitment, customer support, etc. And he did that pretty quickly. I think it was, the timeline was something like 6 months between the initial idea, the testing, and then the scaling up of some of these agents. So it can do that quite quickly. I was also glad to hear him say that he was overwhelmed at the beginning, because when we advise clients, many people get overwhelmed at the beginning of this journey, but then when you start, you can see the benefits, and these compound over time. So interesting advice from Tito. And Jeremy closed that panel. So Jeremy has got his new book out. So if you're interested, Bulletproof Your Marketplace is the title. And he told us, how you can use AI to create the right trust and the right safety environment in your platform, but also reminded us that the bad guys are using AI as well. So the nature of the threat is increasing. And that's one of the reasons why using AI is less and less of an option, because as a defense mechanism, it's almost becoming a requirement in many settings these days. So that's it from the panels. As Laure mentioned at the beginning of this event, AI is once again a transversal theme across all these panels. And we firmly believe that individuals, organizations, and institutions need to prepare for this wave of transformative AI. So we've launched collectiveintelligence.ai. At the moment, we are working on a white paper on the future of search. And the title is Search in an AI World, Navigating the Transformation of Digital Discovery. And all the rules are changing. They're changing fast. We have a small working group. Quite a few people from the community are inputting to that process. So if you're interested, do reach out. But you will be hearing more from us later on this year in any case. So that's it. It's been a pleasure having you all. So thank you all for joining the event today. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you to our panelists, policymakers, executives, academics, and all that. It was great to have such a diverse community once again convene today. Thank you to all my colleagues at Launchworks & Co in the background who are making this possible. So thank you, Robin. Thank you, Justin, Stephanie, Laure, of course, and David, who's been scribbing in real time. And so thank you all. Sponsors are also allowing us to keep these events free. So Launchworks is sponsoring the event, but thank you also to Google who is sponsoring the event with us. And we look forward to seeing you later on this year at our hybrid event that will take place in London and online. So now I'm going to leave you with some scribbing illustrations from David. And that's all from me. Thank you all. See you very soon.